Welcome to VSOW, our deep dive into the world of Christian nationalism. We've got a really interesting collection of sources for this one, including excerpts from Catherine Stewart's books, The Power Worshippers, The Good News Club, and Money, Lies, and God.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so today we're going to try to unpack the strategies, beliefs, and influence of this whole movement. Maybe we can start with you just giving us a little background. Like, when we say Christian nationalism, what exactly are we talking about? Because some folks might just think it's, being a good Christian who loves their country.
Right. Well, it can be tricky because that's kind of the surface level, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Christian nationalism is really a political ideology. It goes way beyond just practicing your faith or being patriotic. It's this idea that America was literally founded as a Christian nation and that it should be governed according to, well, a pretty strict and often very literal interpretation of the Bible.
So they're basically trying to replace our current system, like democratic principles, with like a system based on their specific version of Christianity.
Yeah, pretty much.
Wow. Okay, so that raises a pretty big question then, right? Like, what are they actually trying to achieve with all this? Is it just about, like, influencing culture? Or is there something bigger going on here?
Oh, no, this is about power, for sure.
Really?
Like, the end goal of Christian nationalism is to have control.
Control over...
Over every aspect of American life, really. I mean, the legal system, education, politics, even our culture. They want it all run according to their interpretation of biblical principles.
Okay, so they're not messing around.
Definitely not.
Now, your sources, especially the power worshippers, really dig into the people and groups behind all this. It's like a whole network, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the list of names is kind of mind-blowing. I mean, you've got the Acton Institute, the Alliance Defending Freedom, the American Family Association, Capital Ministries, and that's just for starters.
Right.
What struck you the most about this whole network?
Honestly, I was surprised by how connected they all are. It's not just like a bunch of people who happen to believe the same thing.
Yeah.
This is a seriously organized network, really well-funded and working together to get what they want.
So this isn't just some grassroots movement, right? Like, this is strategic and deliberate.
Exactly.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the specific figures or organizations that you found particularly influential? Like, who are the big players here?
Sure. Let's start with Ralph Drollinger and his organization, Capital Ministries. He's all about influencing politicians directly.
How did he do that?
Through these Bible study groups, believe it or not, he holds them right in government settings, the White House, state capitals, you name it.
Wow, so he's going right to the source.
Exactly. He wants to shape policy by getting these folks in power to see the world through this very specific biblical worldview.
So that's one approach.
Yeah.
Targeting the government from the inside, so to speak. What about people who are working more outside the traditional political sphere?
Well,
like Catherine Stewart talks about this guy, David Barton, and his organization, Wall Builders. What's their angle?
Barton's interesting. He calls himself a historian, but a lot of people accuse him of rewriting history.
Rewriting it how?
To fit this narrative that America was founded as a explicitly Christian nation. He tries to argue that the founding fathers had this very specific religious agenda.
Even though most historians would disagree with that.
Yeah, I mean, the evidence really doesn't support that claim.
It seems like twisting history to fit their worldview is a bit of a pattern here. It came up with Drollinger too, right?
Yeah, for sure. We can see how that kind of historical revisionism plays into their bigger goals. It's all about creating this narrative that supports their ideology.
Right. It's not just about believing it. It's about making everyone else believe it too.
Exactly.
So how do all these organizations actually put their ideology into action? What strategies do they use to gain influence and achieve their goals?
It's a multi-pronged approach, really. They target the legal system, they focus on education, and of course they're very active in politics. And on top of all that, they're masters of propaganda and disinformation.
Okay, well, let's try to break that down a little bit. Starting with the legal system, how are they trying to influence the courts and how laws are interpreted?
Well, groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom and the Federalist Society are key players in their legal strategy.
And what do those groups do?
They're constantly litigating cases, usually related to religious freedom, to try and push the courts in a more, let's say, favorable direction.
So they're trying to use the courts to advance their ideology.
Absolutely.
Can you give us a concrete example of how that works in practice?
Sure. The Alliance Defending Freedom was heavily involved in that Masterpiece Cake Shop case a few years back.
Oh, right, where the baker refused to make a cake for a same-sex couple.
Yep, that's the one. Their whole argument was about expanding the definition of religious freedom to basically allow people to discriminate based on their beliefs.
Wow. So it's not just about influencing lawmakers. They're trying to change the whole way we think about the law.
Yeah, it's a much deeper game than that.
Okay. And you also mentioned education as being a big focus for them. How are they trying to influence education?
They're huge proponents of school choice, vouchers, and charter schools
Why is that?
because they see it as a way to weaken public education. They often paint public schools as hostile to Christianity while promoting these alternatives that are more aligned with their ideology.
So it's not just about providing more options for parents. It's about delegitimizing public schools.
Exactly. And it's
Yeah.
also about having more control over what kids are learning, what values they're being taught.
And didn't Betsy DeVos play a big role in pushing this agenda?
Oh, absolutely. She was a major funder of a lot of these Christian nationalist organizations. And as Secretary of Education, she did a lot to advance their goals.
Right, like pushing for school choice and funneling money away from public schools.
Yep. Her policies definitely had a big impact.
It's amazing how these connections run so deep. Okay, let's move on to politics then. How do they try to influence the political process?
Well, one big tactic is mobilizing voters through churches and pastors.
How do they do that?
They encourage pastors to get involved in politics, to preach about certain issues from the pulpit, and to really push their congregations to vote a certain way.
So they're blurring the lines between religion and politics.
Definitely. And they also use these really sophisticated, data-driven outreach programs to target specific voters and get their message out there.
So it's a very targeted and strategic approach.
Oh, yeah. They're not just leaving things to chance. They're very intentional about how they use their resources and influence.
It's a little unsettling, to be honest. I mean, it sounds like they're operating on multiple fronts here. The courts, the classroom, the halls of government. It's pretty impressive in a scary kind of way.
It is, and we haven't even touched on their use of propaganda and disinformation yet. That's a whole other layer to this.
All right, we mentioned that earlier. I think we'll need to dive into that a little more in part 2 of this deep dive because it sounds like that's a really key piece of understanding how they operate.
Welcome back to BSOW. Last time, we were talking about how Christian nationalism is really a movement aiming for power, not just cultural influence, and we started to look at some of their strategies, like, trying to shape the legal system and education and, of course, politics.
Yeah, and we touched on the whole propaganda and disinformation thing, which you said was super important for understanding their tactics.
Exactly. It's not just about lobbying or legal battles. They're really good at creating these narratives and reinterpreting history to fit their worldview.
This is where it gets really interesting to me. It's like they're trying to control the whole information landscape. So in your expert opinion, who are the key figures driving this whole manipulation of narratives?
Well, Catherine Stewart's work, especially The Power Worshippers, really shines a light on this. She points to figures like David Barton, who founded Wall Builders, as a prime example.
All right, David Barton, we mentioned him before, the whole historical revisionism thing. Can you talk a bit more about how his work fits into the Christian nationalist agenda?
Barton presents himself as this historian, but he's been widely criticized for distorting history to support this idea that America was founded as a Christian nation. He basically cherry picks historical facts or sometimes even makes stuff up to create this narrative that really resonates with his audience.
So he's kind of selectively presenting evidence or even inventing it to fit this predetermined story. Can you give us a specific example of that? Like, how does he actually distort history?
Sure. One of his favorite claims is that public schools were morally superior before those Supreme Court rulings against school prayer back in the 60s. He completely ignores all the huge social and educational changes that were happening at the time to create this sort of false nostalgia that really plays on people's anxieties about modern society.
It's interesting. It's like they're tapping into this sense of fear and loss to get people on board. Was that something you noticed a lot in the source material? That they're using fear as a tactic?
Oh, absolutely. Fear is a huge part of their strategy. They prey on people's anxieties about things like secularization, LGBTQ rights, demographic shifts, all those hot button issues. And then they position themselves as the defenders of this threatened Christian way of life.
It's like they're creating this siege mentality, right?
Yeah.
Like we're the last ones holding the line against this evil force that's trying to destroy everything we believe in. So how do they actually use this fear to get people to support them? Like, how do they translate that into action?
Well, their rhetoric is full of warnings about, this godless or socialist agenda that's supposedly out to destroy America, and they present themselves as the only ones who can save us from this supposed threat. They really try to rally their followers to join them in this, spiritual battle.
It's a powerful tactic, right? This us versus them mentality. It can really make people feel like they need to take drastic measures. And you mentioned before about their attacks on public education as another tactic. Can you connect that to some of their broader goals? Like, how does that fit into the bigger picture?
Their efforts to undermine public education are definitely tied to their propaganda efforts.
Mm.
They're constantly demonizing public schools, portraying them as these failing, dangerous places that are indoctrinating kids with this, liberal, secular agenda.
So it's not just about promoting alternatives like charter schools or homeschooling. It's about discrediting public education as a whole.
Exactly. By creating this distrust in public institutions, they generate demand for alternatives that they can then control and shape according to their ideology.
And that ties back to their support for homeschooling and private Christian schools,
Yep.
right? Which they present as the only safe and morally sound options.
Right. They promote those alternatives as these havens from the supposed dangers of secular education, further solidifying that us versus them narrative and giving them more control over the information and values kids are exposed to.
This is starting to paint a pretty concerning picture of a movement that wants to control not just politics, but like the entire fabric of American society. You mentioned earlier that it's not just about advocating for their beliefs, it's about imposing them on others.
That's the scary part. Christian nationalism, as your sources show, isn't just about religious freedom or expressing one's faith. It's about using power, whether it's legal, political, educational, or cultural, to force society to conform to their worldview.
And they do it all under the guise of patriotism and religious devotion, which makes it harder to question their motives.
Yeah, and that's what makes them so dangerous. By wrapping their agenda in the flag and the Bible, they appeal to these really deep-seated emotions and anxieties, which makes it hard to separate their ideology from genuine expressions of faith or patriotism.
So where does all this leave us? What are the potential consequences of this movement gaining more power? What happens if they actually achieve their goals?
That's the million-dollar question, and I think it's one we need to explore further in the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to VSOW. In parts 1 and 2, we've been looking at the origins, strategies, and some of the key players in the Christian nationalist movement. We've uncovered some pretty disturbing tactics, things like the manipulation of history, exploiting fear, and this very deliberate effort to undermine public institutions. So now, in this final part, I think we need to confront the biggest question of all. What are the potential consequences if this movement gets what it wants? What happens if they actually succeed in reshaping American society according to their vision?
Catherine Stewart addresses this head-on in her books. She makes a really strong argument that Christian nationalism is a direct threat to American democracy as we know it.
That's a pretty serious claim. Can you unpack that a bit more? Like, how specifically does this movement threaten democratic principles and institutions?
Well, their goal is to replace those core tenets of American democracy, pluralism, individual rights, secular governance, with a system based on, well, a very rigid interpretation of Christianity. They're talking about a society where their religious beliefs dictate law and policy. There's very little room for dissent or alternative viewpoints in that vision.
So it's not just about influencing policy within the existing system. They want to completely change the system itself.
Exactly. They're trying to redefine American governance altogether, moving away from individual liberty and democratic representation to something much more rooted in religious authority, as they interpret it, of course.
And that brings up another concerning point. Their idea of a Christian America seems to exclude or demonize anyone who doesn't fit their very specific mold. It's not just people of other faiths, but even Christians who have different interpretations or beliefs.
That's a great point. Their version of Christianity is often so narrowly defined that it leaves out or marginalizes anyone who doesn't conform to their doctrines. We're talking about other Christian denominations that they consider heretical, and of course, any other religion is completely out of the picture. It's a really exclusionary and intolerant vision of American society.
So it's not just a threat to democracy, it's a threat to religious freedom as well, which is ironic because they claim to be defending religious liberty, but it seems like they're actually after religious dominance.
Right. There's this real paradox there. They use the language of religious freedom to advocate for policies that would actually restrict the rights of anyone who doesn't share their worldview. They don't want a society where different faiths can coexist. They want their version of Christianity to be the dominant force shaping everything: law, culture, public life.
Man, this is all starting to sound really bleak. Is there any hope here? Like, what can we do to counter this movement and protect the values of a pluralistic democratic society?
Well, Stewart does offer some suggestions based on her research. One key thing is education. We need to expose their tactics, debunk their historical distortions, and really highlight the dangers of their ideology. We have to equip people with the knowledge and critical thinking skills to recognize and resist these manipulative strategies.
So knowledge is our first line of defense. If we understand their tactics, we're less likely to fall prey to their propaganda and misinformation.
Exactly. We need to be informed consumers of information. We have to be able to separate fact from fiction and spot those attempts to manipulate our beliefs and emotions. Another crucial step is building broad coalitions, bringing together people from different faiths, different political backgrounds, anyone who's committed to defending democracy and pluralism.
That sounds really challenging, especially in our current climate of political polarization. How do we overcome those divisions and create a sense of shared purpose when we're facing such a huge threat?
It's definitely not easy, but it's absolutely necessary. We have to find common ground, focus on those values that unite us: belief in democracy, individual rights, the importance of inclusive governance. Dialogue is key, understanding, a willingness to bridge those divides so we can present a united front against this threat to our shared values.
So it's not just about defending our own beliefs, it's about defending the very principles that allow for a diversity of beliefs to exist in the first place.
That's it. We have to protect the right to disagree, to hold different beliefs, and to participate in the democratic process without fear of persecution or exclusion. That's the foundation of a free and just society, and it's worth fighting for.
Finally, what about our elected officials? What role do they play in this? How can we hold them accountable for upholding democratic principles and resisting the influence of Christian nationalism?
We have to demand that our elected representatives put the Constitution first. They have to prioritize the principles it enshrines. We need to hold them accountable for their actions, their votes, their rhetoric. Silence in the face of this threat is basically complicity. We need to make it clear that we won't tolerate any attempts to undermine our democracy or erode the rights of people who hold different beliefs.
So we need to be engaged citizens, informed voters, and vocal advocates for the values that we hold dear.
Absolutely. Complacency is not an option here. The future of American democracy hinges on our willingness to understand the threats we face and to actively resist them.
Well, this deep dive has been a sobering but really crucial exploration of Christian nationalism. We've looked at its origins, its strategies, and what could happen if it continues to gain ground. It's a real call to action for anyone who values a pluralistic, democratic society.
We have to stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay engaged. The stakes are too high to do anything less.
Thank you for joining us on VSOW. We hope this deep dive has given you some insights into the challenges posed by Christian nationalism and what we can do to address them. And if you'd like to continue exploring this topic, be sure to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. We appreciate you listening to VSOW.